Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Avraham Sela, and I'm the current director of the Davis Institute. At this moment, I would like to ask the Dean of the Faculty, Professor of Neo-Nationalists, to greet the audience and the conference.
Thank you. Usually when the Dean is asked to greet or welcome the audience, it's the usual stuff that people say, you know, I'm most happy that I'm more than happy that you came, and blah, 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 blah. But the Davis Institute is really a key player within the faculty, and a place and a community that is close to my heart. So I did prepare something, and I would like to read it with your permission. It will take, I promise, not more than 3 minutes, but it is important for me to say this here. So Mary Lou and Alan, welcome, and this is especially for you. Looking at the lectures that are going to be lectured here in this conference, I thought that it really these lectures really reflect the idea of the Leonard Davis Institute, namely that we should think about Israel within an environment, A, the Middle East, and B, the world. So it's a place where international relations are studied and researched, but also with a focus on Israel and its role within the community of the Middle East and the larger community of the world, or the Europe and the US, the developing world, and so on. And there is a saying in Hebrew which is Or LaGoyim, which I think has to do with this idea. Or LaGoyim means light unto the nations, and it's a term originated from the prophet Isaiah. It can be interpreted in a particular manner, namely, thank you, now I don't see the, okay. It can be interpreted in a particular or particularistic manner, namely, we are the light, we are the center of the universe. Unfortunately, there are groups in Israel who follow this interpretation. It seems to me, however, that the following interpretation is more in line with the prophet's position. Light unto the nations expresses the universal designation of the nation as a mentor for spiritual and moral guidance for the entire world. But this is expressed not as something that implies special rights or special status, but rather as something that implies a serious and profound obligation. An obligation to serve, an obligation always to see the nation within its environment, i.e., the idea of the Davis Institute. Now another prophet, I'm a secular person, but I like the prophets. Another prophet, Jeremiah, was told that he had been designated to preach to his people. And the Bible says, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee, and before thou came forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. Notice the nations rather than the nation. Once again, the Jewish nation and Israel within and for a wider context and environment. But let me return to Jeremiah. His prophecy was probably during the years 626 BC to 585 BC. At that time, the people of Judea were torn and quarreling. In their misery, they were looking for attractive and new cultures. The nations surrounding Judea realized this was a great opportunity to put Judea to root. It was Jeremiah, according to the Bible, who was chosen to tell his people that if they did not change their ways, their future was gloomy. Jeremiah felt literally sick having to face the nation and preach. Oh, that I were in the wilderness, in a lodging place of wayfaring men, that I might leave my people and go from them, for they be all adulterers, an assembly of treacherous men. But despite these feelings, he did confront his people time and again. People were eager to hear comfort, to see unity, consensus, and they therefore turned a deaf ear to Jeremiah and rushed to listen to the false lying prophets because it was mentally easier to listen to them. It seems to me that Jeremiah was one of the first in an ongoing chain of scholars, philosophers, scientists, artists, who felt and have been feeling that they had to warn, that they had to criticize, and that they paid by not being popular. This list includes Sartre, the humanist surrounded by a cynical environment, Bertolt Brecht, who stood up against totalitarianism and Nazism, Mary Wollstonecraft, the feminist, whose ideas about the status of women as well as the French Revolution yielded mockery, Hannah Arendt, whose Eichmann in Jerusalem was so controversial in this country, Martin Luther King, and many, many others. These people were not popular because they spoke the truth and because they were not shallow and quick on their feet, but rather profound, skeptical, asking questions, raising worries, doing research like one should do research. They tried to persuade their community by reasoning. Matt Miller, a serious journalist and columnist in the New York Times, once wrote, "Speaking just between us, I've had this nagging question about the whole enterprise we are engaged in. Is persuasion dead?" Miller argues that we live in a skeptical time, that people do not want to be bothered by a search for truth or a morally binding policy. At the same time, their minds are fixed and they cannot be persuaded. They are not even open to persuasion. Well, Jeremiah's fate is probably also the fate of us academics in a way, because we cannot help it. It's in our guts, this feeling that we have to ask questions, that we have to do research, that we have to find the right explanation, the right theory. We have to find truth, and once we do, if we have to speak it up and express it. And we do so despite the fact that this makes us terribly unpopular, because truth is not always easy and nice to be heard. This is where the tremendous importance of the Davis Institutes lies. Academics in Israel carry the message of Isaiah and Jeremiah. They are here to analyze, raise questions, do research, find solutions, and offer these solutions even if they are not popular, and then teach. And this is all about us, Israel, in the environment, the Middle East and the world. So I don't know where we would have been, especially in this field of IR, international relations, without the Davis Institute. It's not only the money and the facilities, of course, money and facilities matter, and they do matter, but it's the community that the Davis Institute forms. It's the community of researchers, students, the conferences, the research groups, the PhD students doing the research. It's this entire complex which supports each one of us, which gives us the adrenaline, not to mention the comfort and the mental support to keep on fulfilling our mission. And for this, I am so thankful to you. Thank you.
Dean of the Faculty, Professor of Neo-Nationalists, dear colleagues and students, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to open this conference, which celebrates the 40th anniversary of the Leonard Davis Institute. I wish to welcome you all for attending this session, and especially welcome our international guests who came from the United States, Canada, Germany, and India. I'm especially pleased to welcome Mr. Alan Davis and his wife, Mary Lou, for accepting our invitation to attend this conference and to share this happy occasion with us. The Leonard Davis Institute was established in 1972 thanks to a generous endowment of Mr. Leonard Davis, father of Mr. Alan Davis, whose founding vision for the Institute aimed at, and I quote, deepening our understanding of Israel's foreign relations and diplomacy as part of the international community, end of quote. Along the years, the Institute served as a leading venue of research of Israel's foreign relations, supporting research of supporting research by advanced students and faculty, issuing various types of publications, including the periodical Politica in Hebrew, and holding international academic conferences, seminars, and guest lectures. We are grateful to the Davis family for its generous support of the Institute and its academic activities along the last 40 years, and for supporting this conference too. It was a long and arduous way since we began thinking of holding a special conference on the 40th anniversary of the Institute. Having in mind the Institute's founding vision, and out of a strong conviction that understanding foreign relations or foreign policy making begins with understanding the domestic arena, and given Israel's geopolitical situation, the structure of the conference wished to represent a confluence of domestic, regional, and international perspectives. This is also represented by the composition of participants who come from diverse fields and approaches, including history, international relations, political science, geopolitics, and Israel studies. I wish and hope for a vibrant and thought-provoking conference. And last but not least, a few acknowledgements. This conference would not have come to this point without the help of a number of colleagues of the Department of International Relations, among whom Dr. Oren Barak and Aryeh Katsovich, as well as the Davis Institute staff. In addition to the Davis family donation to our conference, I also wish to thank the American Embassy and especially the American Cultural Center, who also contributed to funding this conference. And in particular, I wish to thank Professor Galia Bar Natan for sharing with me the burden of organization of the conference all along. I want to thank Anat Iluz, Administration Director of the Institute, and most of all, I wish to express my deep gratitude to Hani Mazar, the person in charge of academic events, among others. Hani saved no effort to make the event happen, taking care of all the small details and troubleshooting the problems encountered along the process of preparation, and there were not a few, and we are all thankful to you for that, Hani. And as an expression of our gratitude, I would like to give you, in the name of the Institute, a huge bouquet of flowers. This is also an opportunity to update the audience with the Institute's newly launched Sophie Davis program in gender, conflict, and peace. Thanks to a generous endowment of Mr. Alan Davis and Mary Lou, this program became possible. This program aims at encouraging research of this field at the Hebrew University and making a contribution to the growing international interest in the subject. The program will begin running fully as of next academic year, offering doctoral and postdoctoral fellowships, individual and group research grants, guest lectures and seminars, and supporting new courses on the subject. The program will no doubt enable the Leonard Davis Institute to foster a community of scholars dedicated to the study of varied aspects of gender, conflict, and peace. And with this, I would like to pass the floor, without any further ado, to Professor Itzhak Galnoor, Chair and Discussant of this session. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I am greatly honored to open the opening panel. And the topic is Israel at its 60th, between past and present, which leaves the future out and gives an easier time, unless some of you would like to take the present and look forward to the future. Allow me to start with one subject which I know is going to be part of the presentations, at least I read one of them, and ask a few questions about the state of Israeli democracy. Just questions now. I know I have the questions, you have the answers. First question: how long does it take for a society to feel safe as a democracy? And since I'm not going to go into it, I would just mention that looking back to the past, I think Israel has had a good beginning. I'm not saying that democracy in Israel was rosy or anything. I think that you look at it at a certain stage from, let's say, 48 and on, the beginning was not so bad. And you could trace positive developments. Still, we don't know much about evolution of democracy, but we know one thing. The more a country remains democratic, the better the chances that it would continue to be democratic. That's one thing we can say. Not very profound, but basically true. Now, about a year ago, I happened to be in Indonesia talking about the new Indonesian democracy, and I made this very statement. And the president of the Indonesian state asked, how long? And I said, well, we don't know for sure, but I can guess more or less, I said, that if a state remains democratic for 100 years, the rest is easier. To which he responded, my term is not that long. I thought it was a good answer. So question number 2. Well, the implication is 64 years long enough to say something along this line about Israeli democracy? And since I'm discussing, I'll have a chance to return. Second question. How do you move from the rules of the game of democracy to the more axiomatic part, namely, in which democracy is taken for granted, in which you can say that the values of democracy have been internalized enough so that people consider it as axiomatic, doesn't need to be proven again and again. Israel, question mark. What happens to a democracy in which the trust of the people in the democratic game, or more important, in the values of democracy, has been eroded or hasn't developed? Which Naomi, I'm sure, is going to address. Is there here some kind of a breaking point after which we can say, well, this democracy is in real danger? And with the last 2 questions, I'm moving really into slippery ground. Question number 4. Can Israel remain a democracy with growing economic and social gaps? Now we know there are democracies in which there are those kind of gaps. And we are told that the Israeli economy is strong. So my question is it possible for a country to have a strong economy and a weak society, or a weak social distribution of wealth, etc., etc.? And clearly, this is a major issue now facing Israeli democracy. Last, and I hope I'm not abusing my role as a chair, last question, and this is really perhaps the most difficult one. What happens to a democracy that fails to make the most critical decision as far as the survival of the state and its society is concerned? And I mean, for 45 years, Israel hasn't made up its mind, to use a neutral term, regarding the occupied territories. And now I'm not saying which solution. I'm just asking the question, is it difficult for a democracy and for the trust in democracy and for the rules of the game of democracy and the values of democracy to remain intact or to develop in the direction that they pointed out when the democratic machinery, the whole collective effort of making a collective decision, the whole effort of making a collective decision fails to make a decision which clearly is probably the most critical one, what to do with what happened in 1967, going on now for 45 years. Okay, those are the questions. You can ignore them, you can even not ignore them if you feel like, and I'm now going to give the ground to our presenters. I know that you've been told that you have 30 minutes, but if I may ask, try to condense it a little bit, let's say to 25 minutes. I'll give you a short notice so that we'll have time for discussion. The first paper, and I'm going according to the list here, with your permission, is Professor Ellen Dowty, a dear friend, if I may say so, from the University of Notre Dame, and the topic is International Perspectives of the First Zionist Settlers. Don't forget to add the S to your program. Ellen, please.
Thank you very much. I've noticed that since I began dealing with the first Aliyah, I'm always the first on the program, which has advantages and disadvantages. I'm also going to exploit this opportunity to say something from my service as the first director of the Leonard Davis Institute. Now, it may have been formally founded in '72, but our first founding conference was, I assure you, in early '74. And how do I know that? You may recall there was a war in '73, and I was in the Army for 6 months, and the only time I was let go to come home for a 2-month period was for the founding conference of the Leonard Davis Institute. Our daughter was born 9 months later.
It was a good conference.
And we considered naming her Leonard, but thought that might be a bit awkward for a girl. All right, so I became interested in how it began. Now, normally after my first Aliyah presentation, we skip to '67 or even later, but it seems to me that how it began is important. So the question is, to what extent did early Zionist pioneers of the first Aliyah, 1882 to 1905, seek to integrate the Jewish national movement into a Middle Eastern context, and to what extent did they see themselves as bearers of a European civilization in a non-European world? Now, the first Aliyah, or wave of immigrants, has generally been overshadowed by the second Aliyah, which really kind of has captured the high ground in the ideological battle between the generations. And for this reason, as I see it, the first Aliyah has been relatively neglected in Zionist historiography, yielding pride of place to those who followed it and who claimed a more decisive role in the ideas and institutions that eventually formed the State of Israel. But I would submit that the ones who arrived earliest did set the stage for what was to follow, and they created a framework that influenced their successors in many subtle ways, and that therefore it is important to investigate their stance on critical issues, including the orientation between West or East, or what's been entitled here international perspectives. Let me preface this with two brief notes about the international context. I, in deference to the chair, will not expand on these, but we can talk about them during the discussion if you wish. But two very important points here about the context. The first is the seriousness of the threat to the Ottoman Empire, the sovereign power here at that time. These Ottoman Turks had lost half of their empire over the two previous centuries to a combination of European imperialism and nationalist uprisings by European-oriented minorities. Now, in their eyes, as the Turks saw it, the Zionist movement combined both of these threats. So that's the first fact. The second is, well, and let me add just one thought to that. That is that in this context, the idea that the Ottomans would accept the introduction within their territory of a new community representing yet one more European-oriented minority was the pinnacle of self-delusion. The Turks closely followed the development of the Zionist movement. They made consistent, if ineffective, efforts to prevent it, to prevent Jewish immigration to Palestine, to forbid land purchases by those who managed nevertheless to get there, and then to withhold building permits for those who had nevertheless managed to purchase land. So this is part of the context. The second element I just want to mention in passing is the deep hostility among the indigenous Arab population to all European presence or intrusion. It's been documented deeply, but might consider just one fact that when the European nations opened consulates in Jerusalem in the 1830s and 40s, the diplomats had to be escorted by armed escorts. That was the depth of hostility. Now, this hostility was not nationalist. It's been pointed out that there was no Arab national movement until the 20th century. But you don't need a nationalist movement or an ideology to be hostile to people you see as intruders. So the bottom line is that both the Turks and the Arabs saw the Zionist settlers as Europeans, with all that that implies. Now let me get to the heart of this. Turn to the thoughts of those early Zionists about the choice between European and Middle Eastern models. And at first it might seem quite logical that they would have rejected Europe, which had failed them so miserably. For an entire generation, influenced by the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, Russian Jews had looked to assimilation into a progressive West as the path of the future. Now this vision had been cruelly dashed to pieces by a tidal wave of vicious anti-Semitism that swept Russia during following the 1881 assassination of the liberator Tsar Alexander II and the ascension of his reactionary son Alexander III. To the dismay of young upwardly mobile Jews, even educated Russians had participated in these tragic events or shown a blind eye. And the dominant mood was one of bitter disillusionment. There's one typical example I found in the archives by Ze'ev Dubnov, writing to his brother, the famous historian Shimon Dubnov. He wasn't famous yet, but writing to his brother Shimon, I quote, "With my own eyes I saw the terrible tragedy in one of the more beautiful and enlightened cities, Kharkov as it happens. In one flash all my illusions were revealed, all the beautiful pictures of the future that I and my friends painted for ourselves dissipated like smoke. There is a source of hope. Eretz Yisrael must become our future land." The pattern repeated for a number of people of his generation. Occasionally these expressions did extend to the rejection of Europe as a model. For example, a notable article by one Moshe Eisman appeared a few months after the pogroms began in Hamelitz, which was the Hebrew language weekly that published in St. Petersburg that became the main organ of early Zionists. And I quote from Eisman, "The Jewish people must turn their backs to all the luminaries and mighty lords who choose to assimilate Israel among the nations, and must help one another to settle in the land of our fathers, and must help one another to where there is no Japhet, and therefore no hatred toward the descendants of Shem. There the inflamed mob will not charge us with the libel that we slaughtered their gods. There no one will dare to say that we are aliens. There we will not be enslaved by the fist of an impure European civilization. There we will spread the wellsprings of civilization of the children of Shem among our relatives, the Arab tribes. And the civilization of Shem is wisdom and morality, love of mankind and peace. Ishmael is our brother, the son of Abraham our father, a believer in the oneness of the Creator. And the children of Abraham cannot be predators and plunderers and murderers like the children of Japhet. End quote. An echo of this can be found in the words of Zalman David Levantine, who was the main mover behind the first settlement in Rishon LeZion in 1882. Writing shortly after this, Levantine recounts an encounter with anti-Semites on a Russian train during the first days of the 1881 pogroms. And since the hatred was directed toward all sons of Shem, he resolved to return to live among the sons of Shem. And clearly the idea of assimilating into the Middle East was also favored by Sephardi Jews who were already living in Eretz Israel, and I quote Nisim Malul, "We must consolidate our Semitic nationality and not obfuscate it with European culture. Through Arabic, we can create a true Hebrew culture. But if we introduce European elements into our culture, then we will simply be committing suicide." There were also instances of superficial adoption of Arab dress or customs among some of the early settlers, as they sought to emphasize their sense of belonging to the reclaimed homeland. For example, when they began organizing themselves as guards of the settlements, they imitated the dress and style of the horseback Arab guards whom they had initially hired as protectors. And you've probably seen photos of this. The tendency carried over into the early days of HaShomer, the first defense organization founded somewhat later in 1909. But these were the exceptions. The dominant attitude in Zionist circles, both in Europe and among the settlers in Eretz Israel, was represented by Moshe Leib Lilienblum, one of the leading figures among Russian Zionists, who responded to the article I just quoted from Moshe Eisman in these words: "There are many among us in general who, after the pogroms, let out their fury at the Haskalah in all its aspects and argue that we have to return to the ways of our fathers in the Dark Ages. It is hardly necessary to say that this is so much froth on the ocean." Now, the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, represented the adoption of European culture and ideas. And the first Aliyah was drawn disproportionately from the ranks of the Maskilim, the followers of the Haskalah. They had absorbed much European culture, and while they were disillusioned by the failure of European societies to practice what they preached, they still believed in the fundamental progressiveness of European civilization. And if pressed on this, they would probably have responded that European ideas and ideals were still a model to be emulated, and that the Europeans themselves should give them a try. Now, this was, if anything, more pronounced among those who actually found themselves outside of Europe, in Eretz Israel. Finding themselves in a non-European context, they overwhelmingly clung to the European identity as a point of reference. And they overwhelmingly thought of this identity as a favorable factor in their new and challenging environment. It is striking how often the word European crops up in the earliest writings and expressions of the settlers, whether in reference to European culture, European agriculture, European education, European law and order, European technology, European ethics, and finally in reference to themselves, in agreement with the way they were perceived by the native population as Europeans. What happened was similar to the magic by which later immigrants to Israel from English-speaking countries became Anglo-Saxons. The first settlers had not referred to themselves as Europeans while they were still in Russia, and they had good reason to be bitter about their place of origin. But when they arrived in Eretz Israel, they became Europeans. This unsurprising shift of identity was occasioned in the first place by the undeniable cultural difference they encountered upon arrival. And it was reinforced by the self-flattering perception of the superiority of European civilization. One admittedly extreme example was Yehuda Leib Bienstock, writing from Haifa in 1892, quote, "And in general, Asia has not yet tasted the taste of civilization. And until this day, the biblical way of life continues slowly and in its ancient purity." This is somebody actually here, living here. "Naturally, Europeans, including our Jews, are a harsh dissonance here." End quote. Now, coming from this perspective, it was natural to expect that the Arab inhabitants of Palestine would acquiesce in the colonialization process, just as other peoples around the world were, in this view, falling into the orbit of European influence. It is important to remember the prevailing assumptions of a period in which European powers were establishing their control over Africa and much of Asia after having Europeanized the entire Western Hemisphere. The spread of European models was considered to be synonymous with the spread of modern civilization. The same Zalman David Levantine, who spoke of living among the sons of Shem, also made it clear that the settlers expected to be the senior partner in the relationship, and I quote from Levantine, "And if the colonies are established in bonds of love and peace, then the Holy Land will be a land of freedom and liberty for them. They will not hear the voice of the gendarme and the oppressor, and the Arabs who people the land will submit to them with the attitude of love and respect they show to all Europeans who work the soil and engage in commerce here." End quote. In one account, even the animals belonging to the Arabs have learned to regard Europeans with awe and trepidation. When Arab cattle, sheep, or goats were allowed to graze on cultivated Jewish lands, the practice was to round them up and hold them for ransom until the compensation for damages was paid. Chaim Chassin, another member of the pioneer group Bilu, wrote in his diary that rounding up the animals was not easy because, quote, "the wild beast of the Arab is very fearful of a European." Be that as it may, the dominant attitude was that Jews coming from Europe had much to teach and little to learn from the peoples of the Middle East. This was expressed with great clarity a few years later by Joseph Klausner, editor of the influential journal HaShiloach, which had been founded by Ahad Ha'am. Klausner wrote, "I certainly would not want the Jews to imitate the Arabs and the Bedouins, that is, to be influenced by a primitive culture. We, the Jews, who have dwelt 2,000 years and more among cultured peoples, cannot and must not descend to the cultural level of the semi-barbaric peoples. Is the change of the center to be only this, that we leave the exile of Edom for the exile of Ishmael?" End quote. So it was only natural that Zionist settlers would rely on European protection. They clung to their European passports, invoked the intervention of European diplomatic agents to overcome Turkish resistance to their enterprise. Of course, this only confirmed in the minds of the Ottoman officials that Zionists were in fact simply another agency of European penetration. The intervention of French, British, Austrian, German, and even Russian consuls in support of the rights of their nationals was often vital in supporting the Zionist colonies in critical moments. For example, in the new settlement of Petach Tikva, founded in part by Jews with German citizenship, the German consul not only intervened to forestall demolition of houses there, built without permits, but even threatened to mobilize the German Protestant Templars who had settled in other areas of Eretz Israel from the nearby settlement of Sorona, where today we have, of course, the Israeli Ministry of Defense, to prevent such action. Rather kind of amusing when you consider that these same German Templar settlements became nests of Nazis later on. The parallel between Templars and Zionists had already been noted. Among other things, both faced similar problems of Turkish and Arab hostility. Both were protected diplomatically by their countries of origin. In sum, the early Zionist settlers clung to their European identity for a number of reasons. First, because of the stark reality of very real differences between the world they had left and the new and strange environment into which they had ventured, together with a sense of superiority toward the new setting. Second, this self-perception was confirmed by the fact that the Turkish rulers and the Arab residents also treated them as Europeans. But perhaps most critically, this difference provided the strongest argument in their own minds in defense of the establishment of a new community in the midst of an existing society. This is a key point and it bears elaboration. The assumed difference between Europe and the Middle East and the assumed superiority of the former provided a key justification in relations with the Arab population. This view is splendidly illustrated in an example that not only encapsulates the dominant view in stark language, but also condenses into a few days an evolution of thinking that typically took much longer. The exemplar in this case is none other than Eliezer ben Yehuda, a legendary figure revered as the father of modern spoken Hebrew, but also a key mover in the first Aliyah, who deserves to be remembered for his larger role in early Zionism. In his account, the day of his arrival in the port of Jaffa in 1881, Ben Yehuda wrote, "I must confess that this, my first meeting with our cousins Ishmael, was not a joyous meeting for me. A depressing feeling of fear, as though before a fortified wall suddenly filled my soul. I felt that they see themselves as citizens of the land that was the land of my fathers. And I, the son of these fathers, I come to this land as a stranger, as a foreigner, as a son of a foreign land, son of a foreign people." But in the same account, Ben Yehuda records his feelings a few days later, just a few days later. "I also found a little comfort regarding the general position of the Arabs in Eretz Yisrael, which I have also managed to observe, that in general it is very lowly, that they are impoverished paupers and total illiterates. This fact was for me the first ray of light since the moment that my foot first trod on the land of our fathers." So discovery of the great gap between Europe and the Middle East of their time, as the first settlers saw it, not only made achievement of Zionist goals more conceivable, but also added a positive dimension to the entire project. Zionism would bring the benefits of modern civilization to this unenlightened corner of the world and to its untutored people. This, I call this the theory of benefits, would later become the heaviest piece of artillery in the Zionist rhetorical arsenal in debates over the Arab question. As an example, Theodor Herzl's famous letter in 1889 to Yusuf Zia al-Khalidi of the al-Khalidi clan. But the thinkers of the first Aliyah anticipated Herzl's argument much before this, as in the case of Ben Yehuda. This line of thinking led to the corollary that the issue of relations with the Arab population needed no solution beyond the success of Zionism itself. There was no need to abandon the course of separate development. In a Jewish Palestine, Arabs would be in the same position as minorities in other societies, the position that Jews themselves had so often occupied. In this view, it was not necessary or perhaps even advisable to pursue active programs of integration or accommodation. In a Jewish Palestine, Arabs would enjoy prosperity and humane treatment as individuals, but they would remain separate from the dominant identity and narrative. Even Ahad Ha'am, a separatist with strong liberal views, did not advocate accommodation with Arabs beyond the need to deal with them fairly. His seminal 1891 article, which I discovered had never been translated into English, so I once did this. Anyway, it was written on the occasion of his first visit to the new Jewish settlements of Eretz Israel, and it's often cited as the first serious Zionist recognition of the Arab question. Ahad Ha'am, accordingly, is seen as the first dove in the debates over the conflict. But a closer look reveals that there are only two passages in a rather lengthy and scathing review of the entire Zionist enterprise that deal with the, quote, Arab question, unquote. These two passages, which are quoted endlessly in numerous discussions of the topic, do take a step beyond previous expressions by recognizing a collective Arab dimension and by urging the need to deal in a fair and humane way with Arabs. It was no longer sufficient, given this perspective, to think of the existing population in Eretz Israel simply as non-Jewish individuals who could be left out of the equation. But on the whole, Ahad Ha'am's article fits into the prevailing theory of benefits. Zionism's very success would in the end resolve the issue by creating a Jewish framework to which others would have to adjust. This success would, he reasoned, provoke some hatred by the time that it reached this ultimate goal, but in a passage much less quoted from the article, he added that, quote, "This is nothing. By this time our brothers would be able to secure their position in Eretz Israel by their large number, their extensive and rich holdings, their unity, and their exemplary way of life," end quote. In other words, got it. Even though Ahad Ha'am recognized a collective dimension to the Arab presence in Eretz Israel, he did not see any need to negotiate with the Arabs on a collective level, as one people to another. At a later date, he even denigrated the idea of publishing a Zionist newspaper in Arabic in order to reach out to the other side. The course of events would make this unnecessary, as he saw it. Nor did he, or others of that period with minor exceptions, expect that Zionists would need to use force in order to achieve their goals. At this time, the idea of a Jewish military was still non-existent as a historical legacy or as a conceivable future option. Again, the very success of Zionism would resolve the issue. So Ahad Ha'am was, in the final analysis, the exception that proved the rule. The second integrationist side of the debate was introduced by Itzhak Epstein, an educator who settled in Rosh Pinah in 1886 and was active in the movement to teach Hebrew in Hebrew. Coming at the end of the first Aliyah period, Epstein provided the first analysis that actually projected the eventual dimensions of the problem and introduced the full integrationist agenda. I quote from the article, "Let us open our public institutions wide to residents of Eretz Israel. Let us arrange popular lectures, plays, and musical performances to their taste and in their language. Let us give an important place to the Arabic language in our schools. and willingly enroll Arab children in them. We have a duty to become properly acquainted with the Arab people, their attributes, their inclinations, their aspirations, their language, their literature, and especially to gain a deep understanding of their life, their customs, their sufferings, and their torments. But the separatists were, as noted, the dominant voice. Epstein's article, published in the journal founded by Hanaam, evoked numerous negative reactions, including one from the writer Nechama Pukhachevsky that appeared in Hashaloach itself. Quote, Mr. Epstein said correctly that it is very hard to buy the love of the Arabs. But if so, why should we toil in vain? The more we grovel, the more they hate us. The more we continue to submit to enslave ourselves, the heavier our yoke. So please let us abandon this path of defeat and proceed by a straight track to our rebirth. Let us begin to think about ourselves, our existence, and our happiness, end quote. At this point, the lines of debate begin to look familiar. Obviously, there have been many changes over the years reflecting new circumstances. But at its core, there remains the issue of whether and how the Jewish state could and should integrate into the region. And the debate began with the prevailing view that it could not and should not. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Can you hear me? Okay. I was just wondering whether in researching the attitude of the European Jews who came to Palestine toward the Arabs and the Turks, have you encountered what was their attitude toward the Jewish local people, who some of them came from Middle Eastern countries? But you'll have your chance, and if you have questions, please write them down. Let me move along and introduce Professor Naomi Chazan from the Truman Institute and the Hebrew University and some many other things. And the topic of Professor Chazan's presentation is Political Realignment in Israel, question mark, Neo-Nationalists versus Democrats. Please.
Yeah. There are a few women speakers in this conference. Good afternoon, achar tzahorayim tovim. Just three very preliminary remarks. Number one, I do want to thank the Davis family for being here, especially. It takes a lot to sit through an academic conference, I know, but for promoting the research and the activities you do. I was the first resident of the Truman Institute building when it was, it says nothing about my age, I was a baby at the time, and watched Davis begin to invade, and actually liked the Davis Institute and have cooperated with them for years, so it's marvelous to have you. Second is actually to have Leonard, who slipped out when he saw me getting up, and who was a student of mine and one of my pride and joy, by the way, who gave an excellent introduction about Jeremiah. I'm not Jeremiah, but I am going to talk about the present and the future. And I wanted to tell him that he challenged me then, now as a student, just as he challenges me now. And the third preliminary comment is to our chair, Professor Itzhak Galnoor, who asked all the questions, but I'm going to give my answers. And I hope that by balancing your questions with my answers, I'll be able to wake all of you up at this late hour in the afternoon when it's hot outside and you're drowsy and you really want to go to sleep, but you're stuck, because I will notice when you slip out. Okay, so I'm beginning in a humorous tone because I'm talking about a very serious topic. And if you want to read a little bit more, I do have a fuller paper, and I have written some even lengthier articles on the subject. And I'll fast forward for where Alan Dowty started and come to the present. And come to the present and say very clearly that something is taking place in this country. Israel in its mid-60s is beginning to look very different from the familiar patterns that we were accustomed to even in the past 30 and 40 years. And I would like to suggest that we are in the midst of a realignment which has very clear characteristics, and the outcome of the tug-of-war that is taking place between the realigned strands in Israel will definitely determine Israel's future. So, the two strands that I identify, which do have connections to what we are familiar with, is first of all a growing, hegemonic, neo-nationalist strand, which has taken over and prevails at the formal level in Israel, on the one hand. And on the other hand, there is a second democratic revival strand, which is emerging and gaining considerable traction on the level of civil society. And I ask a simple question. What are the nature of these two trends, and where are they leading? And what I will do is briefly describe the characteristics of each of these strands. Whet your appetite, I hope, to read and to think more about them. I will characterize the tug-of-war that I see occurring in Israel today, look very briefly at the causes. If I had an hour, I would discuss the causes at length and tease out some of the consequences. But I want to make it very clear that what is taking place in Israel upsets some of our theories about the relationship between domestic politics and international relations. Because I claim that the realignment that is taking place in Israel today is a result of Israel's growing isolation. But the nature of the realignment is directly affecting Israel's increasingly marginal position in the international arena. In other words, we have a cyclical process here, which is quite different than what is accepted in the conventional literature on the subject. And therefore, it behooves us to look very carefully at the external sources of domestic processes and the external implications of these very same processes. Now, having said all that, which I'm sure you understood and internalized, at least some people seem to have, I want to discuss very briefly the two strands and go from there. And I will need, Itzhak, that you give me a 5-minute warning, because I tend to speak rather than read.
You can count on it.
I'm sure. We're old friends and colleagues. The first strand that we see now, which is gathering tremendous momentum, literally as I speak, is the neo-nationalist strand, which has its roots, as I indicated, in the growing isolation of Israel during the past decade, and increasingly after the Second Lebanon War and the Gaza operation in 2008 and 2009. The neo-nationalist trend in Israel is governed by a premise that is becoming increasingly prevalent in Israeli public discourse. There is only one interpretation of loyalty to Israel, what Israel is about, what Israel's identity is and should be. And this interpretation substitutes territorial aggrandizement with a communal definition of the state and its destiny. In other words, it is increasingly Jewish-based. In this interpretation, Israel stands alone, but that is okay because isolation is a source of strength and not of weakness. So there is here a very monolithic worldview that is developing. And by the way, it is apparent not only on the front pages of the newspapers, but in the back pages as well. The purveyors of this mindset started off with right-wing groups, many of them settler-based, but not only, but increasingly with right-wing groups in civil society, such as Im Tirtzu, on the blogosphere, Israel Sheli. By the way, if you read their materials, it sounds very much as a repetition of what I just said, but perhaps even more pointed. But, and the important thing is, that these groups have very strong relations with the government after 2009, a very strong representation in the Knesset and among the ministers. In other words, this is not just something that started supposedly on the level of organized groups, but it is increasingly taking on political dominance at the formal center of power in the country. The targets of these groups and this mindset, very clear. First Arabs, then peace movements, then civil rights and human rights groups, then academics. By the way, the most usual suspects are sociologists and political scientists, so most of the people in this room should beware. And if you're a civil rights activist and a political scientist, you're in real trouble, okay? It goes on to artists and performers. Part of the attacks now are directed at the media, as we've seen just in the past few days. Women, by the way, intriguingly, have been an object, especially if they speak out. And the latest target, and by the way, I think in the most cruel and ugly manner, have been asylum seekers from African states. But the threat is clear, and the language is clear. It has very strong insular overtones, and sometimes, I hate to use the term, but extremely racist overtones as well. Some of the things that Alan Dowty talked about 100 years ago, we are unfortunately reading and hearing on a daily basis in this country. The operations are twofold. Very systematic, sophisticated operations on the level, on the public level, in order to narrow the discord, eliminate debate, judge everything, every act, every statement in terms of whether you are a patriot or not a patriot. Okay? There's no substantive discussion to speak of. That's one level. But those of you who think that there is an exaggeration in this analysis, I would argue strongly, think twice, because there is an official level of operations which is now institutionalized. 44 bills of a discriminatory or racist nature have been proposed in the Knesset in the past 18 months alone. 10 of these bills have already passed into law. If you look at recent policies, but whether it be about settlement construction bypassing the High Court, or for that matter, asylum seekers, you will see that these ideas and these people are informing policy and law in this country as well. Think for a minute. The definition of democracy here, and there is a definition of democracy, is a very narrow definition of democracy. We are in power. We are a majority. Democracy is majority rule, right? And that's it. Okay, it's a very formalistic analysis every 4 years or so, depending on deals on national unity governments. Then inevitably also this can recur, and therefore our responsibility is to our voters and to maintain the mindset and the worldview that we were elected to promote. It's a very problematic definition of democracy. It's a very upsetting definition of democracy for many people. Just one word on the external dimension of this strand. It's a very bullish attitude on the Palestinians, on the Arab Spring, on Iran. There is a connection between this kind of approach and a very, as I say, bullish attitude on foreign affairs. Having said that, just one sentence. This is a majoritarian project. It is meant to define the way we think about Israel, what are the values that Israel should promote, primarily Jewish values, without defining what is Jewish, and how to go from here. Now, if that was all that was taking place in the country, and sometimes some people believe that it is all that is taking place in this country, then maybe there were cause for deep depression. But I want to quickly suggest to everybody here that the depression is not a good guide to policy or to any kind of analysis, so let's leave it aside. There is a second strand that is gaining a great deal of momentum, but at the level of civil society, not at the level of the formal power structure. Now, initially, when the moves of the Neo-Nationalists began to gain ascendancy in the public sphere and at the formal level, most Israelis were very happy to do their Pilates, their yoga, and their various forms of contemplation, mostly, by the way, out of sheer and utter disgust of the political sphere. We were, 2 years ago, very much an example of what some of us have spent quite a bit of time studying in other parts of the world, and that is disengagement from politics, indifference. And there are excellent studies of this sort. By the way, disengagement from politics allows neo-nationalists to take over much more easily. But with the stepped-up attacks on particular groups, there started to develop a pushback. First, by the way, by Palestinian citizens of Israel, then by human rights and civil rights groups increasingly by intellectuals who began to see the patterns of what was going on in the country. And then, because we're all techies, the cyberspace was inundated with new blogs, with new Facebook groups, etc., which also started saying, wait a minute, something is the matter here. There is a different Israel. This is not our Israel. There is a different Israel. And we have to give it a voice, a shape, and we have to give it power as well. And this democratic revival, I claim, peaked in many respects last summer with the addition of the social justice protests, or at least portions of the social justice protests, into this mix as well. Now, the groups that are involved here are very clear, so I won't repeat them necessarily, but the basic premise of the democratic revival is very simple in Israeli Zionist terms. It goes back to the Declaration of Independence and the liberal values contained in Israel's Declaration of Independence in 1948, and says individual civil rights, equality, justice, pluralism, and tolerance for all citizens of Israel has been the source of Israel's strength and will continue to be so in the future. So the premise is clear. These groups operate on two levels in terms of where they target their activities. The first, by the way, is the official level, mostly in an attempt to block, prevent, and delay a lot of the policies and the legislation of the Neo-Nationalists. But a lot of the activities are at the level of civil society in an attempt to change the discourse and to develop and mobilize Israelis to counter an Israel that has gained ascendancy on the formal level, which they don't recognize at all. They don't recognize at all. Now, the reason I say that the social protests were important is not because of what you think. And I know I'm getting myself into deep trouble with Professor Galnoor, but it is not whether there was a $1 billion allocation for housing or for early child care on specific aspects, but something else happened last summer, which I think many of you in Israel are aware of today. What happened last summer is that a new generation of Israelis got up and said, we have the power. We can mold our own destiny. We can make a difference in our daily lives and in our society. And that sense of empowerment and engagement is something that has been palpably absent from the Israeli public scene for quite some time. It's the antithesis of the indifference that I described, coming from precisely the same groups. And as a result of that, with a greater feeling of political efficacy, what we have experienced in the past year, since last July, is a constant demand for accountability and a monitoring of every single act of the government and of the Knesset, so that nothing goes without comment in this country in the past year. And it's not just the price of cottage cheese or the price of electricity. It goes much deeper than that. And so you have a revived democratic set of norms developing, but in a very diffuse manner, without coalitions, without, at the moment, a clear leadership. There is what I call a new set of democratic impulses in Israel, which are keeping an eye on the neo-nationalism, maybe even turned to ultra-nationalism. This is a realignment. And I would argue strongly that anybody who tries to put these two strands into the traditional left-right frame will be making a very big mistake indeed. There are connections, but it's not left-right. So let me tease out some of the characteristics of what is going on. And there is a tug of war. A tug of war is a polite way of saying we are on the verge of a pitched battle between neo-nationalists in this country and between democratic forces. And whoever wins this pitched battle will determine Israel's capacity to survive and to thrive. The first element or characteristic is that the polarization in this country is immense. There's a very binary structure to it, to this tug of war. The second, again, is the fact that there is a strong bubble in the middle that both sides are fighting each other over, but eventually will have to take sides. And I want to say that not taking sides is taking sides today. One has to understand that. Another characteristic is the clearly asymmetrical structure of this tug of war, because those in power have a clear advantage over the Democrats at the moment. And finally, in terms of characteristics, one other one, it's more difficult for me to convey, but it's perhaps the most important. In a situation where the number of ministers and deputy ministers is 40% higher than the size of the opposition in Parliament, listen to these numbers, okay? Essentially, what you have is a shift from a vertical struggle, from a horizontal struggle to a vertical struggle. And therefore, politics today in Israel is not what we were used to, struggle between political parties. It is taking on a vertical shape, which is a different game entirely. Now, why is this happening? 4 reasons. I cannot elaborate them. Number 1 is the inability to resolve the conflict and make a decision, something that Itzhak Galnoor did mention. Secondly, the growth of emotions, fear and paranoia, as a backdrop for indecision or for policy. Number 3, I never thought I'd hear myself saying this, so note it. There is a direct correlation between anti-democratic forces and extent of religiosity in Israel. So the religious factor is important. And number 4, there are political motives behind this. And I could trace them and prove them if necessary. Where does that leave us? What are the implications? I think I want to take the implications on 3 levels in the 3 minutes I have left. The first implication is domestic. We are going to have to decide in Israel today something that's very profound. Who are we? What is our identity? What values guide us? Where are we going? And I think it's no secret that I argue that if we're not democratic, we're not going to go anywhere. But this is real, and it can no longer be avoided, because those in power today are taking us on a path which requires a certain response. The implication number one. The second implication is for the Jewish world. If we think this is only about us in Israel, we're heavily mistaken. These questions are now preoccupying the entire Jewish world. And there are serious tensions between right-wing elected organized leadership in North America and in Europe, and between progressive Jews that connect their identity with Israel with its democratic character. And that's the second implication. And the third implication is international. And I will say it in the strongest possible terms. The time in which Israel could expect to get support because of historical memory is over. And what connects Israel to the external world and will help it create its alliances in the future is a question of values. And therefore, democratic adherence is vital to Israel's international support. And that's the third implication. So I suggest to you, there is a realignment taking place here. All I could do is sketch it, but it is much more serious than what I have succeeded in conveying. And its future and the outcome of this tug of war is going to determine Israel's future in every real respect. So it behooves us in our 60s, I know that age well, to start taking a stand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi. With your permission, I'll save my questions to the discussion. One hint, maybe, when the distance between two legs become too great and each is walking in a different way, question mark. Okay? Now, our last speaker is Professor Benny Miller from University of Haifa, and the topic is Israel's territorial orientation. Is Israel a revisionist, status quo, or failed state? Benny.
Thank you very much, Professor Galnoor. I'm really honored to be here for the 40th anniversary of the Davis Institute. Thank you, Professor Sela, for inviting me, Professor Bar Natan. I appreciate very much the support of the Davis family. I always was very delighted to take part in the Davis conferences. I think the contribution of the Davis Institute for the study of political science and especially international relations in Israel is immense, and I'm really proud to be here. The question I'm asking today is, what is the territorial orientation of Israel in a comparative perspective? The territorial orientation is important because territory is a major cause, or at least highly connected with the question of war and peace. So understanding the territorial orientation of Israel would lead us to understand a lot about the question of war and peace that Israel is highly engaged in. My answer to this question is that Israel has fluctuated over time among four basic orientations. Before the establishment of the State of Israel, Israel was what I would call a frontier state, that I will define in a minute. Between 48, or rather 49 and 67, Israel was eventually, especially towards the late 50s, 60s, became a status quo state. After 67, Israel adopted at least some elements of a revisionist state, or qualified the revisionist state, even though there is ongoing struggle still between the status quo and revisionist orientation. And since the Oslo, a few years after the Oslo Accords of the mid-90s, Israel has at least some elements, especially in the West Bank, of a failed state. The question is, the second question that I'm going to address is, what is the most powerful explanation of these variations? I would argue that the explanation is based on what I call the state-to-nation balance. This balance is composed of two factors: the level of stateness of Israel, and the second is the national congruence. What I would like to do now is to try to present a general analytical framework that, based on the combined effect of the level of stateness of a certain state and national congruence, produces different types of territorial orientation, which exercise major effects on the proneness towards war and peace. I will apply them very briefly to these four periods of Israel, and I will try especially to explain the changes over time through these two variables, two factors: the level of stateness and the level of national congruence, and also some inherent tensions between stateness and congruence and inside different dimensions of national congruence. Let's start, Ziv, with the first chart. Okay, thank you. With the general framework, which present these four orientations: the status quo, revisionist, the frontier, and the failed state, and the explanation, which is based on the two factors of the national congruence and the stateness. So very briefly, the four type of orientations. Status quo state is a state which is satisfied on the current order and is unwilling to invest any cost in expanding beyond its boundaries, but it's willing to invest quite a lot in defending and protecting the territories that it controls. Revisionist state is a state which is dissatisfied from the international regional order and is willing to incur high cost in order to expand beyond its internationally recognized boundaries, and even to be engaged in wars that either it generates or at least are derived from its control over these territories. A frontier state is a state which is still in this process of consolidation, of forming its boundaries. Its boundaries are still not clear, and it's still a process of forming the state and consolidating it and its boundaries. The failed state is a state which is prone especially to domestic violence, and it faces the danger of civil war. Let me now move to the explanation, and the explanation is based on this combination of the stateness and the national congruence. Stateness refers to the effectiveness of state institutions, to the level of professional bureaucracy, and especially the military, the police, law and order, and the court system, the ability of the state to raise taxes, but especially to the monopoly over the means of violence in the sovereign territory of the state. If there is this monopoly, then it's a high level of stateness. If there isn't a monopoly, then the state is weak. It's a weak state. The second major factor is the factor of national congruence. Where stateness is kind of the hardware of the state, national congruence is the software of the state, and it relates to the national aspiration, loyalties, and identities of the population of the state. The state can actually be quite heterogeneous concerning its various cultural group and ethnic groups, but still it has high level of national congruence, because national congruence especially refers to what extent there is a joint aspiration for self-determination of all the population of the state in the current boundaries of the state, or to what extent there is dissatisfaction from this fulfillment of national aspiration in the current boundaries and territorial identity of the state. If we combine then the variation of these two factors, high level of stateness and low level of stateness, high level of national congruence and low level of national congruence, we supposedly get these four type of territorial orientations and their effects on war and peace. If there is high level of stateness and also a high level of national congruence, then the state is likely to be a status quo state. The state is able to maintain peace, to enforce peace, and the population is basically satisfied in its national aspirations from the status quo. So basically the state wouldn't aim to expand beyond its internationally recognized boundaries. When there is a high level of stateness, but there is also high level of national incongruence, the state will tend to be a revisionist state. And there are two major sources of this nationalist revisionism. One is the historical, and the other one is demographic. The demographic, when groups of supposedly your own nation live beyond the boundaries of the state, there are going to be strong inclination to annex the territories populated by these people who belong to your nation. The historical dimension is the argument that territories beyond the state were constituted the cradle of the nation, were affiliated with the golden age of the nation. The nation fought its big battles, and it created its spiritual creations. So the state should control these territories. A good example is Serbia and Kosovo. More than 90% population of Kosovo now are Kosovars, Muslim Albanians, not Serbs. Still, Serbia, even under democratic government, let alone under Milosevic, had a very strong aspiration to control Kosovo, and that leads to major international crisis. Supposedly the reason is this historical dimension of nationalism. In 1389, the Serbs fought a brave battle against the invading Ottoman armies, and since then the national identity of the Serbs is strongly linked to Kosovo, and since then it's really part of this national identity, and that explains the persistence of the conflict over Kosovo and all its international implications. The frontier state is the result of weak level of stateness, but a high level of national congruence. Under this condition, the national community struggled to form its boundaries. It still lacks a monopoly over the means of violence, but it's least united in the nationalist aspiration. A good example of that would be actually immigrant societies in the New World, especially in the 19th century, Wild West in the United States, and the South American states, especially after decolonization from Spanish and Portuguese rule, in which there was a big struggle that took quite a few decades for consolidation of the state system, in which actually there was a good formation of nation building, but the state building still took some time in order to be fully consolidated and formed. And when that took place, eventually a peace came to South America much earlier than to Europe. Finally, the fourth type of outcome, or the fourth type of territorial orientation of the state, and its proneness to war and peace, is the so-called failed state. The failed state is the combined result of a low level of stateness as well as high level of national incongruence. Under these conditions, basically there is a failure of both state building and nation building, and under these conditions there is a strong forces that push for secession, push for lessening the control of the state because of competing nationalist agenda. And the big danger of this kind of situation is trans-border violence, and particularly of civil wars. Let's try now to look at the various periods of Israel. Oh, okay. And actually, how we go back? How we go? Next one, and the following. The next one. Okay, okay. We see from this table the application of the general framework to these four periods of Israel and the Yishuv. During the time of the Yishuv, the pre-48 period, the Jewish community in Israel was in a kind of a frontier situation. Basically, the big struggle was land acquisition and trying to settle the land. It was a big struggle about formation of the future boundaries of the state, and the explanation of that is the combination of these two factors. There was, despite actually this successful institution building of institution in the Yishuv, still it was a low level of stateness because there was no monopoly of the means of violence. The British, the Arabs, and the Jews themselves were split concerning the means of violence among the three undergrounds, and in this sense the level of stateness was low. However, there was high level of national congruence. And not only the Jewish population was relatively homogeneous, but definitely it was united in its national aspiration to establish a Jewish state, to fulfill the right of national self-determination of the Jewish people. So in this sense, it was a fairly united community, but struggling under this frontier situation, and that's led to all the various struggle with the Arabs in the 20s and the 30s, eventually culminating with the first part of the 48 war after the partition resolution and until the Arab states invasion after the state is established. Okay, what is the form that Israel engaged in or involved in after the state is established in 1948? There are actually quite strong revisionist inclination. There is dissatisfaction in the political security elite from the 49 boundaries. Moshe Dayan, even Shimon Peres, to some extent even David Ben-Gurion, were not satisfied from the boundaries, and there was a strong, in this sense, strong revisionist inclination. However, after the Sinai campaign, the Suez War, gradually the elite became fully status quo, and even the full-blown revisionist party, the Herut party, which had the idea of the two banks of the Jordan, controlling two banks of the Jordan River, in 1965, when it established its alliance with the Liberal Party and under the Gachal, actually abandoned, at least explicitly, its commitment to the control of, to this revisionist inclination. And in this sense, when we are moving towards 67, Israel actually it's almost united in its status quo orientation, satisfaction with the 49 boundaries. What is the explanation for that? Looking at these two variables, the stateness and the congruence, and we get, I think, the most satisfactory explanation. The level of stateness was quite high. And actually, the most important event in this respect related to two events related to David Ben-Gurion. One is Altalena, and the second is the disbanding of the Palmach headquarters. By that, actually, Ben-Gurion showed himself as a very effective state builder with this idea that there should be monopoly over the means of violence by legitimate state authority in all the sovereign territory of the State of Israel. Even though these two events were very controversial, they led to high level of stateness of the State of Israel almost right away since its birth. Then moving to the question of national congruence. Supposedly, there was no national congruence because immigrants came to Israel from all over the world, Europe, survived the Holocaust, from Muslim countries, with a lot of cultural and ethnic heterogeneity, rather than a homogeneous population. However, because of the commitment to Zionist ideology, to Jewish nation building in Israel, and because of this strong affiliation with this nationalist aspiration and of Jewish self-determination here in Israel, despite all the prejudice, discrimination, and all the huge problems with the mass immigration, I think eventually we can say, definitely towards the 60s, that there is a high level of national congruence, only of the Jewish population of Israel. Obviously, the Arabs are excluded, but we can say that on the whole there is a national congruence because that is the outcome of partition. Because of the partition that happened, even though not exactly according to the 47 line, but still there was a partition. It meant that there was a huge majority of Jewish population in the State of Israel, also due to Arab departure and expulsion of Arabs during the 48 war. So a result of this successful nation building, of Arab departure, expulsion, and marginalization, eventually we can say, high level of national congruence. And this combination of stateness and congruence affects heavily even the Harut party to adopt a status quo orientation towards the 67 war. Indeed, the 67 war is a realist war. It's not a war of expansion, of revisionism, of nationalist revisionism. It's a war of security dilemma. It's a war that derives from fears, from insecurity of Israel that is located in a region of high level of external incongruence because of Arab nationalism and because of the environment that we'll go into details right now, but definitely high levels of national incongruence in the whole Middle East and the Arab world and so on. So the war itself is derived from this security issue. It's in this sense, the realist explanation here is especially important. It's a compelling effect of the external environment that brings about this war. However, following the war, the dilemma that Israel faces is what to do with this occupied territory that indeed Israel didn't aim to occupy them because it was a status quo state. But now Israel supposedly could use them. We have kind of three alternative explanations. Realist, fairly liberal, and this national explanation that I'm proposing here. The realist would mean that it would be that Israel would use the territories for security reasons to protect Israel in the pre-67 boundaries. So especially to focus on those territories that are important for security. Kind of a liberal explanation, let's say, would mean that would lead us to expect that the territories would use for bargaining chips, for diplomacy, for achieving peace or negotiation, land for peace with the Arabs. And indeed, you can say that under Labour government from 67 to 77, basically these two explanations were most prevalent. But already since the unification of Jerusalem, namely the annexation of East Jerusalem and the broadening of the idea of what is Jerusalem, and starting of the settlement process, Israel moves into a revisionist mode. Because once you start to settle the territories with civilians rather than with military camps, for realist security purposes. Military can be moved overnight from one place to another by government control. So, but once civilians settle, obviously it's for the indefinite future. So that indicates revisionist inclination. That is highly reinforced once Likud comes to power in '77, especially later on under Sharon as agriculture minister, defense minister, and so on, and especially when the settlements start to be located in the heartland of a Palestinian population, then it means that really the security reasoning is not the relevant explanation anymore. Because even though supposedly you can raise the strategic depths argument that supposedly it's a strategic realist explanation why you should control these territories, on the other hand you can raise many reasons why the settlements are counter-security, are counter-realist logic. First of all, it infringes upon the key strategic asset of Israel, the alliance with the United States. Secondly, it raises the likelihood of conflict with the local population. But this intermingling of population, as we know, for example, with the experience of Northern Ireland and the Balkans, this is a good recipe for conflict, for violent conflict. So in this sense, the settlements are going against the realist logic. They're also going against the liberal logic, because it's really not anymore a bargaining chip once you have settlements of civilians, because this shadow of the future of indefinite control of this territory. But still, it's not a completely lost struggle to the revisionist camp. Because in nationalism, as we pointed out, there are two components, two major sources, the historical one and the demographic one. The historical one leads to this revisionist inclinations. Because West Bank, Judea and Samaria is the cradle, supposedly the cradle of the Jewish nation, where it has had its golden age and so on, rather than the coastal area, then it leads to this revisionist based on nationalism and annexation, desire to annex these territories, because that supposedly